So now we're going to continue with the embryogenesis, and in the embryogenesis we were talking about the third week of the development. We were at the end of the lecture yesterday. We were talking about the neurulation, and what exactly is neurulation. We said that it is the formation of the neural tube, and the process in the formation of the neural tube is that the neural plate, that is the epiblast, that ultimately form the ectoderm. The ectoderm is then going to form the neural plate, and then this has a small groove in it, and this plate is then going to have the folds rising up on the sides, and then these folds are going to close, and this is going to become the neural folds, and these neural folds are going to close, and it's going to form the neural tube. And this process is exactly what we call as the neurulation. But this tube is not exactly closed at the anterior and the posterior, and there are certain openings at the anterior and the posterior opening, and these openings are what we call as the neuropore. There is an anterior neuropore, and then there is the posterior neuropore, which will be closed in a later period of time. And then the embryo at this stage is what we call it as neurula. If you see this picture, the notochord induces the notochord has been formed. It induces the upper lying ectoderm to thicken and form this elongated plate, which is called the neural plate. Then this is going to give rise to the CNS. Then this is going to give rise to the plate, the groove in the center. These are the folds on the side. Then these folds are going to meet together, and then this is going to form the neural plate that is there. And then this neural plate, neural folds, and then ultimately going to give rise to the neural tube. And then there are pores at the anterior and the posterior, and the opening with the amniotic cavity. Those are called the anterior and the posterior neuropores. The anterior neuropore is going to close roughly at the 25th day, and the posterior is going to close at 28th day. And this is going to give rise to the development of the brain and the spinal cord. You can see the different steps which are taking place. Then this is the tube which is formed. These are the anterior and the posterior neuropores. These are going to close gradually. This fusion starts from the middle. Then these are certain cells which are there on the edge of the neural folds, which are called the neural crest cells. These neural crest cells then separate out from the neural tube, and then these cells, they come to lie on the either sides of the neural tube. These are going to ultimately form into the spinal ganglion. And then the center, this is the notochord, this is the neural tube, which is going to develop into the brain. And then this is the skin. On the top of the neural tube is the skin, which is going to form the epidermis. Then you can see this different process that is there. This process shows you exactly the neural tube has formed, and the notochordal, the neural crest cells which were there on the edge of this tube, they are going to go on to the sides, giving rise to the dorsal root ganglion. And these are also the dorsal root ganglia, or the different branchial arches. When we talk about it, we understand that they go to their respective arches. Then what can be the defects in the neural tube? Defects, that is the failure of the neural folds to fuse and form the neural tube. The two things can happen. There can be a partial absence of brain development, that is called the microencephaly, and it can be a complete absence, that is anencephaly. But that is, it said that it's not at a misnomer. There cannot be a complete absence of development of brain. A small part of the neural tissue is there, so it is called, though it is called anencephaly. Microencephaly is partial absence. And if the closure of the vertebral column fails, the vertebra fails, the brain or the spinal cord is going to protrude out through that region. And this is called the spina bifida, and commonly seen in the lumbosacral region. How can you prevent this? The neural tube defects, that is basically, it is said that if the mother starts, when starting the family, starts to take 400 microgram of folic acid daily, beginning 3 months prior to conception and continuing throughout pregnancy, this is said to have a very positive effect on the neural tube defects. It prevents that. And the various genetic and environmental factors account for the variability. This is a picture of the anencephaly. Anen means absence, of cephaly is the brain. This is spina bifida. Then there is the development of the vascular system, because we said that the earliest system that starts to develop is the cardiovascular system. End of the second week, the nutrition is supplied by the blood diffusion through because the baby is small at that time, so diffusion is enough to supply the from the extra embryonic coelom to the umbilical vesicle and to the embryo. But as the beginning of the third week, the two processes start, what is called the vasculogenesis and angiogenesis. They begin in the extraembryonic mesoderm of the umbilical vesicle as well, that is the yolk sac and the connecting stalk and the chorion. By the third week, something develops what we call as a primordial uteroplacental circulation develops, a small type of a primordial uteroplacental circulation. That is, we've said there is a link between the lacunae in the trophoblast and the sinusoids of the mother. They are going to link up together, and this is what we call as the primordial uteroplacental circulation develops. This is then what you see in the development of the vasculogenesis. Vasculogenesis is the formation of new blood vessels, and angiogenesis, the sprouting, that is the branching, formation of new vessels by the branching of the already formed vessels. This is a cluster of the mesenchymal cells. These form blood islands. These blood islands then they develop lumen into it, and this forms the lumen of the blood vessels, and the lining of these by the mesoderm, they form the endothelial cells, and then these mesodermal cells, they give rise to the blood inside it. So vasculogenesis and angiogenesis, two processes. Vasculogenesis, immediately new vessels are formed. Angiogenesis is the branching of the vessels from the pre-existing vessels which are there. Vasculogenesis occurs by the mesenchymal cells, which differentiate into the endothelial cell precursors, which are called the angioblast. They aggregate to form small blood islands. Small cavities develop in these islands, as shown you in that picture. These angioblasts flatten, they form the endothelial cells, which arrange themselves around these cavities, and they line the blood vessels. And then these cavities soon fuse, and the network of endo channels are going to form. This is vasculogenesis. Then vessels sprout from these newly formed vessels. That is going to be called the angiogenesis. This is the picture which shows you how the blood vessels are formed. Then is the primordial cardiovascular system. That is the formation of the heart and the great vessels. That is because we've said the initial system that starts to work is the primordial cardiovascular system. That is the basic form of the cardiovascular system, the heart and the great vessels. Initially, we said that there was the cardiogenic area in front of the precaudal plate, or the buccopharyngeal membrane, that was in front of the precaudal plate. In that cardiogenic area, that was the area where the heart is going to develop. Two longitudinal channels are going to develop, endothelial line channels. These are called the endocardial hearts. These tubes then unite together, and there is a primordial heart tube is formed. This tubular heart joins with the blood vessels in the embryo connecting stalk, which are present because blood vessels start developing in the connecting stalk, in the chorion, and in the umbilical vesicle to form a primordial cardiovascular system. So heart starts to develop in the cardiogenic area, and that cardiogenic area is where you form the intraembryonic coelom that was in front of the procaudal plate, where then they were divided into the three cavities, that is the pleural, peritoneal, and pericardial cavities. And there was the development of the heart. I showed you a previous picture. And that area, heart develops, two tubes develop, they fuse together, and then they form the one primordial heart. This heart tube joins with the blood vessel, that is by which are being formed by the vasculogenesis and by the angiogenesis, and that in the area of the connecting stalk, chorion, umbilical vesicle, and all this is the linking up of the heart with the blood vessels that are formed. That is called your primordial cardiovascular system. At the end of the third week, the blood is circulating in these vessels, and the heart begins to beat about the 21st or the 22nd day. That is why we say the cardiovascular system is the first organ system to reach a functional stage. And this, by Doppler method, you can even detect it by ultrasonography. This is, it shows the different vessels are formed. These are the tubes which are going to form your dorsal aorta, and then these two, they link up together and form the primordial cardiovascular system. Then we have formed the three germ layers. So these are all the changes which are occurring stepwise in the third week of development. Each has ectoderm, mesoderm, and endo give rise to these three germ layers are going to give rise to specific tissues and organs. If you can see this, this shows you that the endoderm is going to show you the all organ systems formation. That is, their mesoderm is basically circulatory system, lumps, skeletal system, all the bones, muscles, the blood vessels. All this is going to develop from the mesoderm, and ectoderm is hair, nail, skin, and all the nervous system. Then the ganglia, all that is going to be developed from the ectodermal layer. So ectodermal derivatives, that is central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, sensory epithelia, epidermis and its appendages, mammary gland, enamel of the teeth, connective tissue of the head is also ectodermal in origin. So all these are ectodermal derivatives. Then you have the something all which is going to develop from the neural crescent, this long chain of derivatives which are their connective tissue, and so you can remember these. All these are going to form from the neural crest cells. Then you have from something which is going to develop from the endoderm. That is all the organ systems they're going to develop, and the linings. All this is going to develop from the endoderm. Mesoderm gives rise to bone, muscle, heart, kidney, the cavities, lining of the cavities, the cortex of the suprarenal gland. All this is the mesodermal. You have to remember the enumerate all these derivatives. Then there is something what we call as paraxial mesoderm. Mesoderm, because it's not plain just mesoderm, it was divided into three components. The paraxial mesoderm, which formed the somites, then is the intermediate mesoderm, it connects paraxial, which appears in collision with intercellular cavities in the lateral two plates. The later layer continues with the amnion, they develop into the lateral plate as the somatic or the parietal mesoderm layer, or the splanchnic or the visceral, the same way we had it in the ectodermal colon. So the lateral plate mesoderm is again going to split into two. That is the somatic or the parietal mesoderm, that is like becoming continuous as the body wall, and the layer continuous with the yolk sac is the splanchnic or the visceral mesoderm. These are going to form together, they line the intraembryonic cavity. What exactly is happening in the third week? This is a summary. First is the bilaminar germ disc converts into trilaminar by gastrulation. Then there you have the three germ layers which are formed, that is ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. And then you had the oropharyngeal membrane and the cloacal membrane. Cells from the primitive streak, they form the notochordal process. The notochord was formed. Then the neural plate was formed, and then by the neural folds and ultimately the neural tubes, which give rise to the central nervous system, and the edge of the cells gave rise to the neural crest cells. Then the mesoderm on the sides of the notochord form the paraxial mesoderm, which were the somites, which are going to develop into the axial skeleton. Then we form the coelomic cavity arising in the lateral mesoderm, and the cardiogenic mesoderm, a horseshoe-shaped cavity that was there at the in front of the precaudal plate. This was then divided into the three cavities, the proper cavities. Then the blood vessels are formed, the heart is formed by the tubular system, and the primary chorionic villi, they become the tertiary chorionic villi. First the primary, then the secondary, and the tertiary. So these are all the things which are developing in the third week of development. Then we go on to the third to the eighth, that is the terminal part of the embryonic period. That is the embryonic period or the organogenesis period. That was the initial, that was the foundations were laid on, the three layers have developed, which are going to give rise to specific organs which are going to form. This is going to show you exactly what all is going to form. So this period is from third to the eighth week. This is called the embryonic period or the organogenesis period. As we've said, we formed from the mesoderm, we formed the paraxial mesoderm. These paraxial mesoderm is going to form small blocks, for which in the cephalic region, just in the occipital region, it is called the somatomeres. And this is then going to proceed into blocks lower down, and this is going to form the, in association to the neural plate, these are called the neuromeres, and they contribute to the mesenchyme in the head. So the initial portions of the somite which are near to the head, they are called the somatomeres, and below that they are called the somites. So these, in relation with the neural plate, they are going to be called the neuromeres, and they're going to contribute to the mesenchyme in the head. As we've said, the mesenchymal formation of the head and neck region is from the ectodermal region, but otherwise the mesenchyme in the rest part of the body is the mesodermal region. Then from below onwards, occipital region, caudally, the somatomeres organize into somites. Five first pairs of somites arise in the occipital region. The embryo appear in the uh, cordocecal, craniocecal region. These are about 42 to 44 pairs of somites, 4 occipital, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lamadi. Those which are in the 4 occipital region, these are called the somatomeres. Then you have the cervical ones, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 8 to 10 coccygeal pairs of somatomeres. And these somites, they can be used as determining the age of the embryo, because the number of the somites in a specific period of time, they are going to be specific. So with that we can have the idea that the embryo is of this age. Then the first occipital and the fifth to last 5 to 7 coccygeal somites, they're going to disappear. The rest, they persist. The remaining form the axial skeleton, that is the bony structure and the muscles which are around it. Then because it is mesodermal in origin, then the somites appear with a specific periodicity, that is specific number of somites in a specific area. The age of an embryo can be accurately determined during this early time period by counting the somites, because initially, otherwise, there is no other way of determining the age. So, the number of somites appearing in a specific time period is going to help us to tell the age of the baby. So the development of the mesoderm. So this is mesoderm. This mesoderm is then going to form these blocks, which are called the somites. Then you have the intermediate mesoderm, and then this lateral plate mesoderm. This lateral plate mesoderm is going to split into two. That is the somatic, which is going to surround it, and then the outer one, which is going to be the somatic, and then which is going to be in relation with the yolk sac, that is going to be the visceral one. And these, when they are going to the they are going to form the embryonic cavity, which is going to become continuous with the extraembryonic cavity. This shows you the somites. This is the neural tube. This is the notochord, intermediate mesoderm, lateral plate mesoderm, which are split into two. Then the somite differentiation. What does all happen to the somite, and what are all the derivatives which are going to occur from these mesoderms? We have formed first the somite. This is the somite which is on the sides of the neural tube. These are the ventral wall of the somite, and this is the dorsal wall of the somite. Different structures are going to form in this somite. This is the dorsomedial aspect, that is on the dorsal and the medial side of the somite, and this is the ventral or the lateral side of the somite. This is, both these are going to give rise to the muscles, the dorsomedial and the ventrolateral part of the somite, and in the intermediate portion is going to give rise to your dermatome, which is going to give rise to the skin. I'll explain it to you. Organogenesis occurs from the third to the eighth week. That means the after the layers have formed, these are then going to give rise to the specific organs. Three layers rise to specific tissues and organs. But then after that, ultimately still the embryo is not in a human form. Then gradually the different organs which start to appear and distinguish itself, they are going to give rise to the shape of the different organs of the body. So that is why the embryo is given the name as a distinctly human appearance. Then certain exposure to teratogens at this portion is going to give rise to the congenital anomaly. So that is why we say in the organogenesis period, it is very important that the baby has to be protected from the different exposures. What happens in the development is, first phase is the growth, cell division, elaboration of products. Then is the morphogenesis, at the shape and size of the body that changes. And then third is the differentiation, exactly the tissues this specialize to form, that this is the stomach, this is the liver, this is the intestines, that is all this. So stepwise it all goes. First the tissue, one cell goes into two or the multiply, that is growth. Then morphogenesis, that is the development of the baby starts to occur, and then there is differentiation of the different layers of the tissues which occur. These are the three basic uh, groups which are going to occur. First is neurulation. In the ectodermal layer, what happens is neurulation takes place. Neural tube is formed, neuropores, neurulation is complete. The narrow caudal portion is going to give rise to the spinal cord, and the broader cephalic portion is going to give rise to the brain vesicles. That is what is going to happen in differentiation with the neural tube. Neural tube defects, the failure in the tube, that is anencephaly if there is no brain development, and in the cervical region caudally you can have spina bifida. These are the two common structures which can occur. Then the neural tube is closed to bilateral. On the sides of the neural tube, two excuse me, on the sides of the so ectoderm, neural tube is formed, that the broader anterior portion is going to give rise to the brain vesicles, and the normal narrow tubular portion posterior is going to give rise to the spinal cord. Then the neural tube on the sides is going to give rise to two ectodermal thickenings, which are called the otic placodes and the lens placodes. Otic placodes is where the ears are going to develop, and lens placodes are those where the eyes are going to develop in the cephalic region. These otic placodes invaginate, that means aortic vesicles develop, that is small cavity-like structures develop, and this is going to be with the hearing and maintenance of equilibrium, that is where the ears are going to develop. Then the lens plaque would appear in the front. These are going to also invaginate, and during the fifth week, they're going to form the lens of the eye, and that is where the eyes are going to develop. If you see this the picture shows you the otic placard, and this is the lens placard on the sides of the in the ectodermal region. This is where the eyes and the ear they start to develop. Then the development of the medial portion, there is the development of the ventral and the medial walls of the somite. They shift their position to surround the neural tube, that is the mesenchyme. It shifts and surrounds the neural tube around the notochord, and these cells form the what we call as the sclerotome, and these are going to form the vertebra and the ribs. If you see this picture, this is the sclerotome, that is the medial portion, the ventral and the medial portion. That is, this is the dorsal portion, this is the ventral portion, this is the lateral, and this is the medial portion. So the ventral and the this ventral portion and the medial portion, this is going to spread out and spread around. If you see in this, it has spread around the neural tube, and this portion is what we call as the sclerotome. This sclerotome is going to form the vertebra and the bones around the neural tube. This is the sclerotome, part of the somite. So the ventromedial part of the somite is going to develop into and spread out and goes around the neural tube, and it is going to form something what we call as the sclerotome. If you see in both these pictures, right? These are going to give rise to the vertebrae and the ribs. Then the dorsomedial and the ventrolateral edges of the upper region of the somite form the precursors for the muscle cells. In between these two groups form the dermatome, and then cells from both these muscle precursors they go beneath the dermatome. If you see this picture, this is the dorsolateral portion. The dorsal. This is the dorsal part. This is the portion which is the dorsomedial, as you can see in the picture, and this is the ventrolateral. These two ends are going to form the muscles, and this portion, ventral portion and the medial portion, has already formed the sclerotome. So this is the dorsal portion is left, the dorsal, medial, and the lateral. These are going to form the muscles which are shaded brown, and this intermediate portion is going to form the dermatome, that is going to form the skin, dermis, and then these muscles are then going to form underneath this and these brown structures. All these is what we call as the myotome. You can see that this brown structure, the muscles which are going to spread underneath the skin, and this is going to form the myotome. So the somite is divided into a dermatome, sclerotome, and a myotome. Sclerotome is going to form the bone around the neural tube. The dermatome is going to form the skin, and the myotome is going to form the muscles. Both from the sides, they're going to link together underneath the dermis. They're going to form the muscle. So these are the components which are going to develop from the, and all is mesodermal in origin. Okay, so cells from both muscle precursor groups migrate beneath the dermatome to create a dermomyotome, that is together. So from the ventrolateral edge migrate to the parietal layer of the lateral plate mesoderm to form the most of the, from the ventrolateral edge, they are going to form the musculature of the body wall, external, internal, oblique, the external muscles, and most of the limb muscles. The cells in the dermomyotome, that is which are underneath, they are going to form dermis of the skin, back and muscles for the back, body wall, intercostal muscles, and some limb muscles. So different areas is going to give rise to the muscles of the different areas. The myotome and dermatome retains its innervation from its segments of origin. So from where, at what level they arise with the paraxial mesoderm, because they are in relation with the neural tube at certain segments. So that from what segment they are arising, they're going to get its nerve supply. So that is, each somite forms its own sclerotome, its own myotome, and its own dermatome, and has its own segmental nerve component. So that means it has its own bone, it has its own muscle, and it has its own skin. So all that area which is coming from a single segment, that is from a single somite, is going to give its, retain its innervation. Then part is the intermediate mesoderm. Intermediate mesoderm is going to give rise to the development of urogenital structures. Then is the lateral plate mesoderm. This lateral plate mesoderm is going to split into two, that is the parietal and the visceral layers, which line the intraembryonic cavity. This is all going to give rise to your serous membranes, which align the peritoneal pericardial cavities and secrete, as we've said, they already spread, and they form on either sides of the developing baby, and then they encroach onto the interior end of the procaudal plate, and then they unite together and they form a U-shaped structure, which is then going to be divided into pericardial, pleural, and peritoneal cavities. And these all, they become the secrete the mucus fluid, serous fluid. Mesoderms of the visceral layer form a thin serous membrane around each organ. So that is, the lateral plate is going to develop into the coelom, and the coelom, the outer one is going to form the parietal layer of the coelom, and the inner one is going to form the splenic or the visceral layer of the coelom, and this is going to form the mesothelial linings of these visceral cavities which are there, and it's going to produce the serous fluid. If you see this, then blood vessels are also going to form in the continue two ways, by the vasculogenesis and by the angiogenesis. Blood cells are also going to form. First, the blood cells, they develop in the wall of the yolk sac. This is a small time period for which the blood cells are going to. Then this definitive hemopoietic system, it forms surrounding the aorta and comes to stay in the liver. So that becomes the major hemopoietic organ. Then after second to seventh month, this development stops and the liver shifts its blood formation into the bone marrow, the definitive bone forming tissue, in the seventh month of gestation, and thereafter liver loses its blood forming agent. So there are three phases. In the first phase is the wall of the yolk sac, where the blood vessels are developing and in the blood cells are developing. Then the hemopoietic system shifts over to into the liver, and then from the liver it shifts over to the bone marrow, and gradually after the seventh month, liver is no longer concerned with the production of the blood cells, so it produces in three steps. This is capillary hemangiomas, abnormally dense collections of capillaries, as you can see, in that form most common tumors in infancy. They may occur anywhere, often related with the face, that is the collection of the abnormally formed capillaries or the blood vessels. They can be focal or they can be diffused. Endoderm gives rise to all the organs which are there. Folding of the embryo then occurs in the third to eighth week. That is, initially the embryo was flat, now it is going to occur folding. The folding is going to be craniocaudal, that is both from the front backwards and also from side to side. So this folding is going to give rise to certain more development. Significant event in the development of the body forming is folding of a flat trilaminar embryonic disc into somewhat a cylindrical embryo. Folding occurs both in the median and the horizontal planes due to rapid growth of the embryo. The growth rate at the sides length of the embryonic disc fails to keep pace as the embryo increases rapidly. So the growth rate at the sides and length of the embryonic disc fails to keep pace with the embryo increasing all the time. So folding of this occurs as the disc is growing more rapidly on the sides as compared to the central portion on the sides. So this is going to start to fold. The anterolateral and side to side growth is not going to be compared with each other, so they are going to increase rapidly in length. So the folding occurs at cranial and the caudal ends, and sides of the embryo occurs simultaneously. Because of the increased growth, the folding starts to occur in both the periods. Folding of the embryo in the median plane. The folding of the ends of the embryo ventrally produces the head and the tail fold. That is, in the cranial end, it is going to go ventrally, and in the dorsal end, it is going to go, the caudal end, it is going to go ventrally. So you produce something where a ventral curvature. This is what we call as, this is your A picture, shows you the starting of this ventral and dorsal caudal, the cephalic and the caudal foldings ventrally and dorsally. This caudal fold, the cranial fold, is going to be called the head fold, and this posterior one, this is craniocaudal folding. The posterior one is going to be called the tail fold. That is, if you see in C picture, this is the folding that is occurring. The growth of the, right, the embryo produces head and fold tails. The growth of the brain vesicles, that is embryonic disc, bulges into, as it goes ventrally, the head is going to bulge into the amniotic cavity. That is when it is folding cephalocaudally. Pronounced in the regions of the head and the tail, they produce what we call as the head fold and the tail fold. Larger portions of the endodermal germ layer is incorporated into the body, and this gives rise to a gut tube, which is divided into three regions, that is foregut, midgut, and hindgut, communicates with the yolk sac. If you see in this picture, starting from the A, this is the arrows show you the cephalic caudal folding, and this folding As if you see in this B picture, the head is going to protrude into this amniotic cavity. This goes forwards and ventrally. This produces the head fold and the tail fold. When this is occurring in the head fold and tail fold, this part of the yolk sac, which is being incorporated into this curved and developing embryo, this is going to nearly take up whole of the yolk sac into it, and this endodermal cavity which is going to be taken up, this is going to be called your foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. That means this is going to develop, the endodermal component is going to develop into the gut tube, that is your intestinal system. So that anterior portion is going to be called your foregut. The middle portion of the yolk sac is going to be called, which has been taken up inside, this is going to be called the midgut, and the posterior part is going to be called the hindgut. So this is the curvature. This is the foregut. That is the oropharyngeal membrane. That is, this is going to form where we had the procaudal plate and where we had the oropharyngeal membrane. This is going to form your oral cavity. And then this was the allantois, which was in the posterior part. And if you see in this picture, then the picture in the B, that is the neural tube, this is the notochord, and this is the developing brain. This is going to go into curvature, and this was the place where the ectoderm and the endoderm were in contact with each other. That was called the oropharyngeal membrane, and in front of it was the precordial coelom, which gave rise to the development of the heart. This, when curvatures is going to occur, if you see in the C picture, the procaudal plate comes to lie, or the buccopharyngeal membrane, they come to lie to on the ventral aspect, and this part of the yolk sac which is taken up into it, that forms the foregut. This foregut is which is going to develop into the oral cavity, and then this buccopharyngeal membrane or the oropharyngeal membrane is going to rupture, thus communicating with the amniotic cavity, and this is the oral cavity that is formed. This is cephalocaudal folding. Then there is the at the head fold. What you see is the cephalic end is temporally bounded by the ectoderm endoderm membrane, what we called as the oropharyngeal membrane. This membrane separates the stomodium, that is the primitive oral cavity, from the pharynx. That is their ectoderm from the pharynx, that is from the endoderm. This is separated in the fourth week. This membrane is going to rupture, establishing an open connection between the oral cavity and the primitive gut. So this part is the oropharyngeal membrane, which separates the part which is going to become the oral cavity and the part which is going to become the foregut. Then at a certain age, this is going to rupture, and then there is a communication between the oral cavity and the foregut. Okay. In the fourth week, oral pharyngeal membrane ruptures, establishing an open connection between the oral cavity and the primitive gut. Then there is the posterior part, you have the hindgut, where the ectodermal membrane, we had the, if you remember, the ectodermal and endodermal membrane, which were united, which had the cloacal membrane. This membrane separates the upper part of the anal canal. That is, the anal canal is developed from two portions. The lower part is developed from the ectoderm, the upper part is from the endoderm. That is, the cloacal membrane from the lower part is called the proctoderm. There is the invagination of the ectodermal portion called the proctoderm. This gives rise to the lower part of the ectoderm, and the upper part is going to be developing from this cloacal membrane. So that is the separation between the ectodermal and the endodermal portion. And the proctoderm is that part which is going to give rise to the ectodermal component of the anal canal, that is at the tail fold. This shows you lateral folds also form and move ventrally to sustain the body. Now that was the front to back folding. This is going to occur on the side to side folding. That is, there is the fusion of the two sides, that the embryonic cavities, they fuse together, and as you can see in this picture, they become one. And the lining, that is the mesenchyme, that is going to form your mesoderm, that is going to form the parietal and the visceral mesenchyme. Then there is the lateral folds, results folding of the head and tail, two lateral body wall folds. The folding goes onto the lateral side. The primordia of the ventrolateral wall folds towards the median plane, that is from both the sides. It comes to come onto the, from the dorsal aspect, these fold and they come to onto the ventral aspect, rolling the edges of the embryonic disc ventrally and forming a rough cylindrical embryo. Okay. Then the ventral body wall of the embryo is closed except for a small part in the umbilical region where the yolk sac duct and the embryonic incorporation of the allantois is there. If you see this picture, that when the two sides they are coming together, they are going to meet together in the center. This is just small part. All this ventral part of the body is closed. It's only this part of the gut which is there, which is going to form the mesentery, and the small part of the connection which is going to form the gut and the yolk sac. You see, this was the initial portion, the folds from side to side. Then this becomes narrow. That is the connection between the yolk sac and the endodermal cavity inside becomes narrow gradually. This is the connection between the gut and the yolk sac. And this is then becomes the tubular system, which is going to be the intestines, which is covered by the mesoderm. Then ultimately what we see is that it's just a small one, and then this even is disconnected, and then what you have is this intestine which are going to develop, and this becomes the embryonic body cavity. The yolk sac dark allantois umbilical restricted to the umbilical region. Yolk sac is vestigial, and after sometimes it is going to disappear. Then initially there is a wide connection between the midgut and the umbilical vesicle. Later on, by this side-to-side folding, this connection is going to be reduced, and that is what we call as the omphoenteric duct is called when it becomes between the yolk sac and the connection between the endodermal sac pouch. That is called the that is going to be reduced. That is called the omphoenteric duct. As the umbilical cord forms from the connecting stalk, the ventral fusion of the two lateral fold reduces the region of communication between the intraembryonic and the extraembryonic coelom cavities to a narrow communication. As the amniotic cavity expands, orbitates most of the extraembryonic coelom. If you see in this picture, the coelomic cavity, the gap between the extraembryonic and the intraembryonic coelom, that decreases, as you can see in this picture, and the amniotic cavity there enlarges and it nearly surrounds the whole of it. Cavity. See, you can see this. This is the part which is going to form the different parts of the endoderm, which are going to give rise to the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. Then the external appearance during the second month. So what happened was all that process continued. That is the discs formed, the blood vessels formed, neurulation took place, the appearance of the facial, that is the lens plaque formed, the otic plaque formed, all these things were good. Then there starts the folding. That was the cephalocaudal folding, which formed the head fold and the tail fold. The head fold, there is going to be formation of the stomodium, and that is the buccopharyngeal membrane ruptures, and there is communication with the oral cavity with the pharynx. And then at the posterior end, it is going to form the proctodium, that is the cloacal membrane is going to rupture, and there is communication between the proctodium, that is the ectodermal portion of the inner canal, with the endodermal portion of the inner canal. And then as this is occurring, the cephalocaudal fold, the head fold, and the tail folds are forming. The side to side folding also occurs, and this makes the body cavities come as one, and then there is fusion between the two. The ventral is closed except for a small part, which is where you have the umbilical region. As you can see in this part, this is the part where you're going to develop your umbilical cord. This part is where you're going to have only the small part which is going to be in communication. Otherwise, all this side to side folding has occurred. Now, the appearance, external appearance during the second month is the end of the fourth week. The embryo has approximately 28 somites. The main external features are the somites and the pharyngeal arches, which can be seen. The age of the embryo is therefore usually expressed in somites, and also the become difficult as gradually the growth increases. The crown rump lung, that is from the crown till the back, that is where you have the buttock, between the buttocks, that area is taken as the age determination, that is the length of that portion. Crown rump length is the measurement from the vertex of the skull to the midpoint between the apices of the buttocks. So initially the somites were used as the parameters for measuring the time period or the age of the embryo. Then it is this crown rump length. Differences are greatest before the end of the first 4 weeks of development, less gradually as the growth goes on. In the second month, external appearance of the embryo is changed by an increase in head size, formation of limbs, face, nose, ears. All this is differentiating. By fifth week, forelimbs and hind limbs appear, and the forelimbs are located dorsal to the pericardial swelling. Hind limbs appear just caudal to the attachment level at upper, and They are attached at the cervical and the thoracic level. The lower limbs, they are developing at the up lumbar and the sacral region. See, this is the second week. You see the lens placode, otic placode. These are the pharyngeal arches which have developed. You can see the somites which have formed on either sides of the neural tube. These are the limbs. That is the on the cephalic region, the cervical and the thoracic region, and the lumbar and the sacral region is the lower limb. But this is the portion. This is develops by the side to side folding, and then it's only all it becomes one the cavity because there is the ventral fusion, and this is just where you have the connecting stalk. Birth defects. The birth defects can be major in this area, as we have already said. When the differentiation is occurring, systems are formed during third to eighth week. This period is critical. Excuse me. This period is critical for normal development. Therefore, this period is organogenesis, as we've already said many times, that organogenesis or embryogenesis, stem cell population establishing, and each organ primordia sensitive to insult from genetic and environmental influences. Any exposures to the genetic modifications or environmental will affect because differentiation is going on. Third to eighth week is the time when most cross structural birth defects are induced because of any exposure that is there. The mother may not realize she's pregnant during this time, critical time period, and particularly vulnerable. That is, if she has no idea that she is expecting and she is exposed to all sorts of hazards, then more chances of the birth defects being there. So, because always remember, whenever there is this is the time period till the eighth week that the differentiation process goes on. There are the seeds are laid, the stem cell populations are being laid down to develop into the different organs, and so more chances of the abnormalities to be formed if hazards are exposure to the hazards is there. And that finishes the third to the eighth week. Now, so what exactly we have formed in the third to the eighth week is taking it layer wise is the organogenesis. Third to eighth week is called the period of embryonic period or the organogenesis period. So you have the what are the organogenesis in this? The age is determined by the paraxial mesoderm, that is the somatomeres. The paraxial mesoderms near to the occipital region, they form these blocks. Those are called the somatomeres, and lower down they are forming the blocks which are called the somites. These are somites, as we've said, they are in numbers 42 to 44. Different groups of somites are there, and these somites are helpful in determining the age by the counting. The periodicity of the age is estimated. Then there is this somite differentiation. It is going to form its sclerotome, it's going to form its dermatome, and it's going to form its myotome. That means myotome is going to give rise to the muscle, sclerotome is going to give rise to the bone and the cartilage, and the dermatome is going to give rise to the skin. So you can see that different portions, the ventral and the medial portion, is going to give rise to the sclerotome, which is going to form the bone. These ventrolateral muscle and dorsomedial muscle, this is going to form the portions of the muscles, and this is ultimately going to spread underneath the portion which is going to become the dermatome. So this is going to become the dermomyotome. And each is having a spinal segment from each leg. Well, this dermatome is going to have in its individual portion. So again, we say the innervation is going to be from the same spinal segment. That is, that dermatome, myotome, and sclerotome arising from one spinal segment is going to get its nerve supply from one nerve, from the same nerve, whether they stay in the same portion or they move away. So remember that. This was the organogenesis. Now, in the second, by this time, the baby is more looking like a distinctly human appearance, and we can see the different features which have arise. The growth, morphogenesis, and differentiation are the three steps by which there is the production of the embryo. In this period, the brain starts to develop. The neural tube had already formed. The neural tube is going to form the wider upper portion, which is going to form the brain with all the different curvatures, and the lower portion is going to form the spinal cord. And then these neural tube defects, they are very critical at this time period. So to prevent these neural tube defects, the giving up of 400 milligram of micrograms of folic acid 3 months prior to conception and going on till full time of the pregnancy will lessen the number of the defects, neural tube defects. Then, along with it, the more appearance, that is the otic placodes and the lens placode, they start to appear in the ectoderm, and then they develop into the ears and the lens. If you see in this picture, this again is the baby is giving you more of human looking appearance. Then these somites, they're developing into the ventral and the medial walls, dorsomedial developing into the sclerotome, into the dermatome and the dermamyotome. This is going to form the cells from the ventrolateral edge migrate into the parietal layer of the lateral plate mesodome to form the most of the musculature of the body wall. Cells with the dermamyotome, that is the muscle which goes underneath the dermatome, that is going to give rise to the skin, ultimately forms the dermis from the skin and the muscles from the back of the body wall and some of the limb muscles. While the rest of the body wall muscles are going to develop from the ventrolateral edge. External, internal, oblique, transversus, abdominal, most of the limb muscles. Then each has its own nerve supply. Then the intermediate is going to give rise to the genitourinary system. Lateral plate is going to give rise to the body cavities by dividing into the somatic and the splenopluric mesoderm. And then there is the blood vessel formation. The blood vessels, the cells first initially were formed in the yolk sac, then they formed the definitive hemopoietic system. That hemopoietic system was your liver. Then this liver ultimately shifted on to the bone marrow formation, and that became your definitive blood forming system. So at this time period, the definitive system became the bone marrow. The blood forming system was the bone marrow. So from blood cells pass through three stages. First is in the mesoderm of the yolk sac, then in the liver, and then from the liver to the bone marrow. And collection of abnormal production of these capillary hemangiomas can lead to these tumors, which are there. Mostly it is seen on the face. Endodermal gives rise to all sorts of organs of the body, that is respiratory system, gastrointestinal tract, and all that. Then starts the important thing, that is the folding. At this stage, the folding of the embryo, that is at the third month, the folding of the embryo occurs in two directions. One is cephalocaudal, and then the other is the side to side. This significant event is first the embryo, the trilaminar disc is flat, but then starts to fold, becomes a cylindrical thing, both because of the growth of the median portion and the horizontal planes. The length is growing, the growth rate at the sides and the length of the embryonic disc fails to keep pace as the embryo increases rapidly in length. So there's disproportion between the anteroposterior growth and side to side growth. So to accommodate that, there is the folding of the embryo, and that produces the cranial and the caudal ends, and the folding starts to accommodate the abnormal growing length. When you have cephalocaudal folding, this is going to produce a head fold and a tail fold. The head fold is going to be the area where you have the buccopharyngeal membrane, and that buccopharyngeal membrane is at the area where you're going to develop the oral cavity. That is the stomodium, and in that part, at certain time period, the buccopharyngeal membrane is going to rupture out, and then there is going to be a communication between the foregut and the amniotic cavity. And then as the cephalocaudal folding is going on, you can see that more and more of the endodermal tube is taken up. You see it here over a picture. This one. You can see as the when cephalocaudal folding is occurring, more and more of the yolk sac, that is the endodermal portion, is taken up into the body cavity, and this is going to then divide into the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. and this is the its connection with the amniotic cavity level is the oropharyngeal membrane, and that is the area where you're going to develop the oral cavity. This stomodium is going to rupture, and the stomodium becomes continuous with the oral cavity, the foregut. And this is the tail portion. There you had the formation of the cloacal membrane. This cloacal membrane is the upper end of the production of the anal canal. Lower portion is going to be produced by the ectoderm, that is the proctodium. And when this proctodium ruptures, both becomes the endodermal and the ectodermal portion of the anal canal is going to become continuous with each other. ठीक है, divide. So, and this endodermal gut is taken in, and this is going to form the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. This is going to form your gastrointestinal tract. And the midgut is going to communicate with the yolk sac by the way of the Wittline duct. That is the this small narrow communicating portion is called the Wittline duct. That is because more and more the connection between the gut system and the yolk sac is going to gradually become narrow and narrow. And as this becomes very narrow, this is going to be called the Wittline duct. Headfold, at the headfold, the change that is occurring is oropharyngeal membrane separates the stomodium, that is going to be the oral cavity or the mouth cavity, from the pharynx, which is going to be your pharyngeal arches. Then there's the tail fold, that is a posterior curvature. There you have the cloacal membrane. We already did that, and we have already mentioned that separates the upper part of the anal canal and endodermal, and then from the lower portion, that is going to be the proctodium, that is the ectodermal component. Then lateral folds also form and move ventrally to assist in the body wall closure from side to side, become one. You can see this produces the two lateral body folds, the primordia of the ventrolateral wall folding towards the median plane, rolling the edges of the embryonic disc ventrally and forming a rough cylindrical. So when the flat thing is curved from side to side and it meets, the two edges meet, and this becomes ventrally, it forms the cylindrical structure. The embryo becomes cylindrical. The ventral wall of the embryo is closed except for a small portion. Only that part is exposed where you have the umbilical cord in future. By the fifth week, the yolk sac duct, allantois, and umbilical vessels are restricted to the umbilical region. That is the area where you have the connecting stalk. Only this is going to pass through it. And then the yolk sac becomes vestigial. Initially, wide communication then becomes narrow, that is called your enteric duct, then forms the, at that area is the connecting stalk. And as the yolk sac becomes small in size, the amniotic cavity increases in size and obliterates most of the extraembryonic coelom. So at the end of this time period, you are usually expressed in somites, and then somites, you measure the length of the baby by the crown rump length. For and then again there is the appearance. We had otic placode, we had the lens placode, brain starts to appear, blood vessel starts to form, then we had the appearance of the hind limb and the forelimb paddles appeared, and they are also formed. So at this stage, all the foundation stone of all the systems has been laid down. It's just going to increase in size. So that is why this period is called organogenesis, and very much chances of exposure. If you can see, this is the end period of the second month, third month, and third to eighth week, and so more like human looking appearance. And that is why more chances of exposure because of the birth defects at this time period, because there is differentiation process going on. And if the mother is not conscious that she is carrying a baby, then more chances are, because she will not take care, and there will be more chances of exposure to the hazards, and so birth defects would be more. So this is the reason why we say this period of organogenesis is critical for normal development. It's called the period of organogenesis or embryogenesis. Okay, so that finishes third week to the eighth week, and we have talked about the organogenesis period or the embryogenesis period. That we said there were two periods. First was the embryogenic period, and then from third month onwards, we go on to the fetal period. That the baby is then going to be called as the fetus. We use the term. So next time, inshallah, we will talk about the fetal period. We have laid down all the systems. Blood vessels formed, blood has formed, heart tube has formed, heart and the blood vessels are linked, forming the primordial cardiovascular system. all the three germ layers are formed. The ectoderm starts to form the nervous system. Mesoderm forms the bone, muscle, skin. All these things start to form, and the endodermal portion layer forms all the gut system and all the different organs which are there. Then the lymph buds are starting, and they appear. Then there is lens placode appearance. Then there is the otic placode, ear and eye also start to develop. So basically, all the systems have started to develop at this time period. And then, because there's the growth of the baby is going on more rapidly, and to accommodate that, the body starts to fold in the caudal caudal cranial caudal direction, and also from side to side. Something which was flat initially, that becomes more cylindrical when the two sides meet together, and all the curvature, and only the small portion which is exposed is that portion which is your connecting stalk. And the connecting stalk stays contains the allantois and omphomesenteric duct, and the vesicle which is there. So all this is ultimately going to become your umbilical cord. Okay then. Inshallah, next time we'll continue with the fetal period.